3. Hello and welcome to the third part of this story writing 3-minute skill. So I'm on to kind of the most, well, not the most important, but an equally important part of story writing, which is the editing part. Now, I can't remember who said it, but some famous writer out there said kill your darlings, and it didn't mean your children. He meant your creations. If you find yourself getting too precious about your own work, then you won't be able to edit it and look at it in any way that is independent. If you become too precious about it and you think it's all perfect, then it's never perfect, and you must expect to lose a fair amount of your first draft in the subsequent redrafting. So my way of working is usually to start with a raw draft, and this is always handwritten, and I write it whenever the inspiration strikes. So I may not necessarily have a notebook for it, but I do bits and pieces. I write small scenes in the empty pages of a diary, on the backs of bits of paper. That's kind of the way my brain works. When it comes, it comes. So my raw draft is always handwritten, various bits of paper or pads or whatever. When I'm writing a story, I will just put all that lot together and just stick it in a folder as I do it. If I've started the planning and started to work out the plot of the storyline, I'll be able to note down what bits I've done, because my brain doesn't necessarily work in a logical manner. I may have the final scene before I have the first one, or I may have a meeting in the middle somewhere, which I may not have decided where it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen somewhere, so I can write those bits and pieces, and then actually sit down, have a serious look at things, and bring it all together. So that tends to be the first kind of stage of the first edit, is where I need to go back through all my bits of paper or my notes and clearly cross things out that don't belong and should never be there. And those things should be glaringly obvious. As you read through, you realise that you've added a character or you've added a scene that is unnecessary, and you'll feel it in the first draft. And then from there, I will type up my first draft, and I will leave it there to start with as a typed copy. I'll just save it and leave it on the computer, or I usually print it out because I find editing easier on hard copy, and I will leave that for as long as I can. If I've got the time, I'll leave it for a month. If not, then a week can be enough, because you need some level of separation from the story. If you're doing a short story, then a week is fine. If you're doing something that's taken you a long time to write, then a month at least is a good separation. That way you can look at it with a slightly fresher eye and see where things have been going wrong. So then comes my kind of first review stage, where I basically go back through my my first edition, or my first copy, and realise exactly how I've dug myself a hole and not got out of it. Most of the time I've put characters in situations that they wouldn't get into. I've given them decisions that they wouldn't necessarily make, and things like that that you need to kind of pick out and sort out. And I've most likely changed the eye colour of my characters about 3 or 4 times along the process of a long story. So things like that you can pick up on your first review. So then I go through and edit that, and then put that away again for again at least a week. So ideally, if I could, I'd put them away for a year. There are some stories sitting in a box under my bed that I haven't looked at in about 4 years, which I may get round to at some point, but they're not kind of pressing things at this moment. And then I move on to my second review, and that's where I look more seriously at things like the punctuation and grammar, things that I've kind of let slip in the previous edits. I tend to be a little bit sloppy with that kind of thing in the first couple of edits, because it's just the first edit and I'm just rushing to get it down. So your second review, you're looking at that, and you're looking at the flow of the story. whether it's got a logical kind of progression, you're not leaping from one place to another, so you've got a logical flow from one place to another. You're looking at your character dialogue. Does that have the right kind of feel to it? Now, I don't mean doing accents and that kind of thing, because writing an accent is really quite difficult to do and difficult to get right. So I try and avoid as much as possible writing accents. Occasionally I'll let my characters drop off G's and T's and that kind of thing, just to kind of make it feel a little bit more relaxed. But I really avoid trying to make an accent. I tried to write in Scottish once, that really didn't work. So things like that, where I've got sloppy with my writing style, that's where I come back on my second review. And things like adverbs, where you put a word that ends in ley, so distractedly, or things like that. They sound clumsy in a sentence. I think Stephen King rants about it a bit in his book on writing, and I understand where you add this thing to try and qualify the way things are said, but you don't need to say that. You can most of the time get away with just saying he said, she said, and using what is in the dialogue itself to indicate if they're angry, if they're not, if they're frustrated. You can describe your character as pacing as they speak, and clearly that means they are agitated. You don't need to say they said agitatedly or something like that. So those sort of things I pick up in my second review, and then I leave it for as long as possible before it needs to be handed in or finished, essentially. Most of my stories I've not written with any particular deadline in mind, but if I do have a deadline in mind, I'll leave this last review as long as possible, to within 2 or 3 days of deadline, and then you have your polish, and that is just going back through and finding those odd bits of typos and odd bits of things that don't quite fit, and that should be your final look at this. Now, I have come to a polish and a final draft 3 or 4 times of the same story, and I keep adding bits, keep taking bits away. But that's just the nature of kind of the way I write, because I write in a fantasy world, and I'm always expanding this fantasy world. Then there's always other bits to add, and there's always that temptation to want to add more. But in this day and age, you can't get away with doing a Silmarillion, which is what J.R. Tolkien did after the Lord of the Rings, after the huge magnum opus that is Lord of the Rings. He also put together the Silmarillion, which is all the histories and all the other stories that you don't get in the main book, which he got away with because he was the first to do it. But there are no writers these days that can get away with that kind of overwriting, really, and excessive histories and that kind of thing. There are plenty of the Anaraki superfans out there that all write this kind of stuff. They all put together the ultimate compendium on the Dark Tower series or that kind of thing, and that's a good book to read alongside the Dark Tower, but it's not a part of the Dark Tower, if you understand me. So there are 5 things with editing that I find particularly important. And this goes for any kind of story you're doing, and it goes for essays and anything else, writing in general, poetry as well. So first things first, punctuation and grammar. Things that you should know, really. It's awful to read a really, really good story and have a whole load of very simple punctuation mistakes or grammar mistakes in there. It just kind of pulls you away from the story. If you find single typos and things in a good story, it just draws your mind away from the story, so you miss things and it doesn't flow right. So punctuation and grammar, spelling in particular, but nowadays it's all online, or all on computers, so most of the time they're correct, but there are some times where the little grammar bot comes up and says something's wrong and it's really not. So you need to have an awareness of what you're trying to say, how you're saying it, and why you're using a particular style of punctuation. You should have learnt this stuff in school. It always helps to get yourself a style guide, and that kind of gives you an idea of where things should go and how everything fits together. And 2, narrative. Now this kind of comes with the plot. If you've done enough plotting, you should have some idea of where your story's going. But it should make sense where you're going, unless you're going to write something like Jack Kerouac on the road, where there is no sense to it whatsoever, you're just travelling. Unless you're going to do something that's stream of consciousness, you need to make sure there is a simple flow, there is a point A to point B to point C flow of events, and it's a logical flow. 3. Dialogue. As I said before, I avoid writing accents. If you can do it well, then by all means get on with it. But if not, you need to know that your dialogue actually works and flows. So just saying it in your head isn't enough. You need to be able to sit and actually speak out loud to make sure that you can say these words, you can put these sentences together and they make sense to you. And then you've got the actions. Whenever your character decides to do something and does something, are they doing what you expect them to do? Have they suddenly gone from being really an honest person to suddenly stealing from someone? Or something ridiculous like that without a reason? There should be a reason for every action. If they're randomly killing people, then that's not... you need to explain it. You need to say why they're killing people. Dexter only kills murderers. You know why. He does his research, he finds out who they are, and that they'll never be caught by the justice system. He's got a reason for his actions. And then 5. Will my reader like it? Now, whenever you're writing, you should have one person in mind who is your ideal reader. Mine is a former housemate who hasn't actually read any of my recent stuff, but I know what she likes, so I'm writing for her because the version of her in my head has very particular likes and dislikes, and is very particular about the way things are said. And as long as you satisfy that one person, then that should be good enough to go on with. So most of what my reader likes is the top 4, essentially. Things that make sense, things that are correct. But also the feeling of a story. If it's supposed to be a joyful story, if it's supposed to be a search for something, you need to be satisfied by it. So will your reader be satisfied by this story? Now, I'm not very good at giving my work out and letting people read it. Many writers aren't, because they're kind of scared that when this thing you've been working on for months gets out into the light, it'll turn out to be nothing. So this is a step you need to get over. You need to get your work out there. There are plenty of online writers' forums where you can post your work and get critiques on it. And don't take it personally. If someone says it's bad, as long as they are giving a critique, they're giving an honest answer, an honest critique of it, and they're saying it's not great because of this, or this doesn't make sense because of this, then that's all well and good. If they're just being a mean troll and just saying everything's bad, then you can ignore them. But if they're giving you a good excuse for why they don't like this thing, take it on board. It is always useful to have a second opinion. So, yeah, those are my the three most important parts of story writing, at least in my opinion. So, yeah, I'm going to put, or I already have put my the first book in my novel series online through Kindle. I'm actually in the process of redrafting because I haven't read it for 8-9 years, and having reread it before I started doing these, I realised exactly how bad it was. It's really quite sloppy. So I'm going through it and redrafting. So I'll be re-releasing that in stages as I go along. So if you want to, by all means look it up. I'll put the link in my blog. So yeah, look for that if you particularly want to start reading a fantasy series, and I would really like some sort of feedback on that as well. That comes in handy. So yeah, that is pretty much it for my very, very long 3-part 3-minute skills. So I'll see you